Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode 245 of Stand Up. Joining me today, two brilliant authors. First, Dr. James S. Gordon, the author of The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma, and constitutional law scholar Carlton Larson, who wrote On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law. I talk with both of these guys about their excellent new books, and my mom and dad join me for the news. I'm Pete Dominic. Time to stand up with me right now. Hey guys, welcome to the show. Still planning on hanging out with you Thursday night at 8 p.m. on Zoom. If you're not a subscriber to the stand-up community, sign up now. Go to the paid subscription link in the show notes or patreon.com/Pete Dominic and sign up for a paid subscription. Be a part of our hangout, be a part of the Discord chat, be a part of our very supportive, awesome, honest, thoughtful, kind, generous, hilarious community of people. Thursday night, 8 p.m., Boston Globe columnist Michael Cohen is set to join us. And lots that I wanted to mention here and play for you in this first segment of today's episode. First of all, I want to thank you for all of your nature picks. Get that vitamin N and send it to me. People from all over the country and even all over the world. I got a picture from Thailand tonight from listener Ed Rush, who lives in Thailand, sent a picture from his bedroom window. It's lovely. Got so many pictures from so many other people as well emailed to me. Keep them coming. I love it. Get that vitamin N, get outside, get that nature, and I'll talk a little bit about why that matters with Dr. Gordon coming up. Also wanted to thank listener Tanya, sent me a very nice email. She said, Pete, I love your show, and I love reading your morning email, which gets me out of bed. The morning email is something that every subscriber gets with a description of the show and a little hello, some links. She says, I find it much harder to get out of bed the last few months. The one thing that works is opening up your morning email and seeing who is on your show. It really motivates me to get up, lace up my shoes, and go for a walk so I can listen to the whole show uninterrupted. I jump out of the bed the quickest when I see Christian Finnegan, Jay Alcovan, or Barry Ritholtz are on. They are always my favorite and make me so happy. Thank you for working so hard. Your show means so much to me. Tanya, thank you. I love these emails and the feedback. It's so great to hear and so motivating and inspiring and gives me so much purpose. So thank you very much, Tanya. I think the biggest story from yesterday, outside of every COVID-related headline, was that the Supreme Court rejected the Republican effort to overturn Joe Biden's win in Pennsylvania. Also, the House passed defense spending bill with veto-proof majority despite President Trump's opposition. But the COVID headlines are something I like to give you here at the top as well. Hospitals are considering now which workers to vaccinate first. West Wing fears in the White House that COVID is spread after Trump lawyer Jenna Ellis attended a White House party. On vaccines, AstraZeneca's vaccine apparently is proven to be moderately effective. The FDA review of the Pfizer vaccine is clearing the way for emergency authorization there. It has been given now to the first citizens in the UK, including the first person to get the vaccine is a guy named William Shakespeare. That's hilarious. Seriously, that's true. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, said the first Canadians will be vaccinated next week if regulators okay the Pfizer doses. New York State, my state, is considering legislation that could make the COVID-19 vaccine mandatory. That'll be interesting. Joe Biden is aiming for 100 million shots to be given in the first 100 days of his presidency. The state of Nevada is now treating COVID-19 patients in a parking garage as the pandemic is raging in Reno, Nevada. And California is using a text alert to ask millions of residents to stay home. Obviously, there are a lot more headlines, I'm sure, in your state, in your municipality, county, or country, and send them my way. I'll just mention them to give you an update pretty much every show here at the top. But now I want to play some audio for you. First of all, the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, was on The View, and the whole interview is worth listening to. But they asked her if she thought that Donald Trump can pardon himself, and she said, I don't think so, but listen to this.
So he can preemptively pardon individuals, and the vast majority of legal scholars have indicated that he cannot pardon himself. What he could do is step down and allow the Vice President Pence, to pardon him. In all likelihood, I suspect that he will pardon his family members, his children, his son-in-law, and individuals in his administration, as well as some of his close associates. And then I suspect at some point in time, he will step down and allow the vice president to pardon him. Now, it's important to understand he is pardoned from federal crimes, but he is not pardoned from state crimes. Last year, I introduced a bill in the state legislature which would close the pardon loophole so that individuals such as the President of the United States would not evade justice. It's important that we have this check on presidential powers. And in the legislature, the state legislature, I'm so happy they passed that bill, and it is now the law in the state of New York. President Trump cannot avoid justice in the great state of New York.
Yeah.
So just to reiterate, there's no way a potential pardon for Trump or his three eldest kids would shield them from anything you're investigating. Am I right? That's what you just said, I believe.
Correct. Joy, it's important to understand that my investigation is civil in nature. However, in the event that we uncover any conduct or activities which would suggest criminal activities, then that would change, obviously, our investigation. It would change the posture of our investigation.
Yeah, and you can bet your ass that she's looking. That's Letitia James, New York State's Attorney General, on The View on ABC yesterday. And Tuesday night over on the CNN, Erin Burnett had Michigan State Rep Cynthia Johnson on her show. You may remember last week the Trump legal team led by the traveling circus of the COVID-2, Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis. It was the one where Rudy farted. Anyway, he was in Michigan for a hearing, and there was a really memorable, quite awful exchange with that seemingly drunk white girl, Melissa Carone, who was parodied on Saturday Night Live last weekend. Anyway, State Rep Cynthia Johnson was very vocal in the questioning about outlandish claims. She said that they were lying. She wanted them under oath. And CNN on Tuesday night played the voicemails that she's been receiving. She's been receiving horrific threats. I'm going to play those for you right now. They're obviously disturbing, but these are the dumbest people who make these threats. And State Rep Cynthia Johnson's reaction is worth hearing. But listen to this dumb cracker.
I hope you like burning crosses in your front yard, because I'm sure by the time this is all said and done, there will be several. I hope you are dead by now. You are a piece of shit. You need to be run out of office and hung from a tree, you dumb.
Yes, that last one was, of course, the N-word. This woman, Cynthia Johnson, is actually black. I probably should have mentioned that. But this coward isn't going to burn anybody's cross. He's not going to do anything. He hasn't probably left his own home in years. He probably lives there with his family because nobody likes him. He can't get a job, much less meet a woman. Nonetheless, it doesn't make it any less scary and horrific. But here's another one. And this lady is equally as stupid and horrendous and disturbing. And super racist, of course. Cracker number 2.
You're so done. Should be swinging from a rope, you Democrat.
Now, here's the audio from the hearing last week that these insane, vile people were reacting to. Here is State Rep from Michigan, Cynthia Johnson.
You have a point of order.
Yes.
What is your point of order?
Point of order is to have them under oath.
You're out of order. As I've said, this is something that is not done here in this state. It's really only...
it may not be done under the state, but you're allowing people to come in here and lie, and I know they're lying.
Representative, you're out of order. I've indulged you, but you're out of order.
You condescending prick. So here is Cynthia Johnson on CNN with Erin Burnett asking her about how she felt about it.
It was shocking, but it wasn't surprising. And I say that only because we are living in a time where, although we're in 2020, it reminds me so much of the early 50s and the 60s. It reminds me also of, and this situation reminds me so much of domestic violence. It reminds me of how women are abused and talked down on and demeaned, and many women don't respond to it. They're too afraid. Well, I'm letting all women know right now, trust and believe, this is a form of domestic violence, and we should not put up with it. Here we're talking about people who are saying racist attacks and nasty names and just unconscionable things that's being perpetrated really on people of color, specifically Black people. Here I'm in the state of Michigan. I'm a Detroiter, a lifelong Detroiter. Yeah. We have people who are homeless. We have people who don't even know where they're going to live next month. We have Black businesses that are disenfranchised. We have people who need stimulus checks yet. And I thank God for you and all of media. But we still have to deal with this ugly, racist thing called human beings, actually.
Aaron Burnett went on to ask her, first she said it takes a lot of courage for you to speak out like this. And are you concerned that they're going to act on these violent threats? And here is the very courageous Cynthia Johnson's response.
Absolutely not. I'm not afraid of those threats. What I have found is that many of these cowards are just that, cowards. They speak behind the computer, or they'll call me, and if I happen to pick up, most of them will hang up. So to ask me if I'm afraid, I thank you for that question. I appreciate that. And for all the well-wishers, I am fine. I want to tell you that, but God has another plan for all of this country. Yes. And I'm hoping that this will be the time that racism will really be addressed.
All right. That is Cynthia Johnson. I think I'm going to reach out to her office myself and just tell her how awesome I think that she is. State Rep from Michigan, Cynthia Johnson. Senator Ted Cruz wants the Supreme Court to take up yet another case on behalf of the Trump campaign. And so Jake Tapper had George Conway on. George Conway is a constitutional law scholar as well as former Trump aide Kellyanne Conway's husband. Everybody knows who George Conway is, right? I heard Kellyanne Conway, he just gave Kellyanne Conway some job in the federal government. I'm still trying to figure out why he started handing out jobs at the last second to a whole bunch of his asshole friends. Anyway, here is George Conway on CNN with Jake Tapper answering the question about whether or not Ted Cruz or anybody else is going to be able to bring a case successfully to the Supreme Court. And conservative Republican George Conway absolutely shits all over that idea. Listen.
It doesn't have a snowball's chance. They're going to deny the emergency application. Ted offered to argue the case. There's going to be no argument because you don't argue emergency applications. There is no federal issue in that case for the Supreme Court to accept or resolve. That case came from the state courts of Pennsylvania, and the issue was whether or not the Chapter 77 or whatever the law was that was passed in 2019 by the Republicans in the state legislature, whether that violates the Constitution of the state of Pennsylvania. And the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania has said that it doesn't for good and sufficient reason. And they said in this particular lawsuit, we don't even have to get there because this lawsuit was brought too late. If you wanted to challenge this law, you should have challenged it right after it was brought or before the election. And the Supreme Court can only take cases that involve federal issues. They don't get to decide what state law means. They don't get to say to Pennsylvania Supreme Court, hey, you misinterpreted the Pennsylvania Supreme Constitution. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court has the last word there. There is just no federal issue in this case. There's no basis for the emergency injunction. And even if there were some kind of a basis, even if there were some kind of an argument, there is no way that any court today, after these states, including Pennsylvania, have certified their electors to the archivist of the United States, that they're going to overturn that certification and demand and order that a new election be held, which is essentially the relief that they're seeking, which is completely insane.
It's crazy.
All right, Jake Tapper and George Conway went on. The whole interview is absolutely worth watching. Really interesting. So George Conway, of course, was a conservative Republican, and now listen to a Democrat who's an election law expert for the Democratic Party's election lawsuits. And he put this out on his Twitter, @Mark E. Elias.
50 losses in court.
That's right, everyone. I'm Mark Elias from Democracy Docket, and Donald Trump has finally done something that no one thought was possible. He not only lost a statewide recount in Georgia once, he lost it twice, and then he added to boot a loss in a recount in Wisconsin. But today, he added to that list of accomplishments 50 losses in court in the post-election for him and his allies. We have seen the Kraken filleted into little pieces of like calamari. We have seen his fail to decertify elections. We've seen him fail to throw out ballots. We've seen failures of conspiracy theories. But today was the day when all of those added up to 50 losses. Now, things are not over from here. We're going to have to continue to mop up the remaining pieces of the Kraken that are now sort of spread on the floor, but we'll sort of sweep them up, along with a bunch of the other cases that are pending still. But know this, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris got the most votes and won the Electoral College in a landslide. We all know that. And we're now going to see the process play through. We'll have the electors meet on next Monday around the country, and they will affirm that victory. And then, of course, Joe Biden will take the oath of office on January 20th at noon.
All right, there you go. Mark Elias and a whole bunch of other sound clips for you. Do that at the top of every show, pretty much. And then the next segment is the news dump, which I've been doing for a couple weeks now, I think, pretty much every day. People really liking that. Great feedback on this. I don't do COVID headlines or politics in the news dump, and this one's a little different because I invited my mom and dad to join me for today's news dump, and maybe you can be my next guest on the news dump, and we'll do it a little bit like this.
Welcome. This is Chuck Dominic. I'm Pete's dad. And this is episode 245 of
you're getting a little. I know, Dad. I know that you're. I was about to say my dad is joining me. I know that you're eager. Before I
going to announce you, Pete.
I know, but before we started here, I texted you to be ready at 9:00, and I just before we start the news dump, I just wanted to read our text messaging conversation, if you wouldn't mind.
No, I was gonna.
I said I'll see you at 9 p.m. and you wrote, "I can't wait to perform and be on stage again."
Yeah,
I miss the lights, the action, the adulation, stardom.
Yeah.
Well, it's great to have you back, Pop.
Why'd you stop me then? I've been waiting for this.
Oh, I'm sorry. You want to go ahead, get us started, I guess, then.
Introduce you.
Okay.
This is,
don't usually have anybody.
This is episode 245 of Pete Dominic's podcast. I'm his old man, and I'm here with my wife, Mary, his mom. Mm-hmm. And Pete has been doing this show for over a year now. And we're all pretty excited to get on with this because this is going to be like a family show. And Pete's been priming us for this, so we'd like to get it going now. Okay, Pete.
So just say, now it's time for the news dump.
And now it's time for the news dump.
They call them dumps, big, massive dumps.
I would agree with that.
All right, here we go. Dad, do you want to get us started with the first story?
Yeah, Howard Wales is dead. He I don't know if he's grateful that he's dead or not, but he was the pianist for the band The Grateful Dead. He died at the age of 77. And also, John Lennon has died 40 years ago.
Oh.
Now, John Lennon died at age 40 years ago. Yep. So that means he would have been 80, which means that most of the population of the United States wasn't alive when John Lennon was alive. So I really wonder, do they know who John Lennon really is?
It's a great question, Pop. And while we're talking about famous dead people, I've got one for you, Mom, Dad. Retired Air Force Brigadier General Charles Chuck Yeager, the World War II fighter, pilot ace, and quintessential test pilot who showed he had the right stuff. In 1947, he became the first person to fly faster than sound. He has died. He was 97. That's Newser.com. I'm reading from Chuck Yeager, Pop. Gone.
Yeah, he's gone, huh? I did not know that. So he's with Howard, and John Lennon's been waiting a long time.
All right, what's your next story?
Interestingly enough, I like to read about Mount Everest. That's a big subject of mine. I don't want to go there because it's cold, it's windy, and it's very hard to breathe.
You're doing a lot of editorializing. Can we just get the story rather than your whole background?
Yeah, well, it grew.
Jesus Christ.
The mountain grew.
The mountain grew.
It grew according to according to my sources, Outside Magazine said it grew 3 feet, and National Geographic said it grew 2 feet. Now, this sounds like a mistake, but one of them says it's 29,032 feet, and the other one says it's 29,031 feet. Now, they had geologists or whoever does that stuff, I don't know, from Nepal and China, and they agreed on this, that it has grown either agree that it's grown 2 feet or 3 feet, depending on which news article. So they spent probably millions of dollars trying to figure out how tall is Mount Everest, and when they got all done, nobody could translate what they were saying, obviously.
I got a story related to that kind of, Mom. Listen to this. This is, it sounds tragic, but it's not. It ends happy. CNN.com reporting a climber has been rescued alive after falling 15 feet into a volcanic crevice on Mount Hood in Oregon.
Yeah. Yes. Yikes.
Yeah.
That's very scary.
Fell right
How
into
long was she there, or he?
Oh, wow. You assumed it was a woman. Did I say that it was a woman? She, Caroline Sunbaum, 32, was there for 3 years.
What?
I'm kidding. I don't know how long she was there. What the hell kind of question is that? All right, Dad, next story.
3 feet. What was geez, I don't know. Oh, you know what? It's coming to the 2024 Olympics.
Yeah.
You and Peter should get in shape.
I'm Peter.
You and Peter, your brother Brian.
Yes.
You, Peter, and your brother Brian. God, this is so exciting to be able to get this across to you guys. I'm beside myself. Breakdancing is going to be in the Olympics in 4 years. Yeah. And if you guys know, you both were breakdancers in your prime at 14 and 16. Okay, I admit it, you're a little bit past your prime now, but I think you should start getting back in shape, get your stiff bodies going, and maybe you can watch it on TV.
Get out your parachute pants. Breakdancing's an Olympic event. Stay with me, Pop. I reported that one yesterday. Here's one. A 12-year-old New York City boy's joyride lasted for more than 100 miles, according to the New York Police Department. A 12-year-old drove his family car from New York City to Delaware with his 7-year-old cousin in the car, Mom. Did we ever do anything like that?
No, thank heavens.
Can you believe that a 12-year-old could drive that far?
Nope.
They left Queens around 10 a.m. Cops found them more than 4 hours later after they tried to use a family credit card at a rest stop.
Where were his parents at this time?
It's a good
they
goddamn.
Didn't know he was missing?
They were in the back seat sleeping.
That's a good question, Mom.
They were there.
All right, Mom. I think you have you didn't have a lot of stories. Do you have a story for us? Do you have anything? Are you prepared with anything?
Well, I don't know where it's from. I couldn't find it again. No. But it was about otters in Oregon. And I love otters. They're one of my favorite animals. Very comical, very funny.
Wow.
And in Oregon, they have been disappearing.
You just are mentioning a story that you remembered reading. You didn't come prepared at all for this story about the otters.
I did not. Well, I tried to find it, but just so I could reread it, but I can't find it again. Well, I'm just having a lot of problems.
Well, listen, I'm sorry to hear that. My next story comes from my Apple Watch, guys. It says, there's still time to meet my exercise goals. Thoughts on that?
What time is it?
I don't know. It's like 10 o'clock at night. Dad, next story.
You got 2 hours.
I got to go for a run. Next story. Dad, go.
You're not going to believe this, Pete. This is a real, on a more local note.
All right.
Every night at 6:30, coyotes howl in our backyard. Every night at 6:30, you can set your clock by it.
Okay. That's.
I don't know what that means.
Great story, though. Speaking of nature, well, this isn't really nature. This is a climate change story. According to The Guardian, greenhouse gas emissions are transforming the Arctic into an entirely different climate. Warmest temperatures since the year 1900 have all occurred within the past 7 years. The Arctic, guys, is rapidly transforming into a less frozen, hotter, biologically altered place. So there you go.
I think that my story about the people who died is much more up than that story.
Yeah, that's you're not wrong.
Yeah, that's just not a charming.
You got another one? I got one. You got one?
No, not on my. No, I guess not.
Okay, well then react to mine. Here it is. Final story. Okay. A massive goldfish weighing 9 pounds was found in a South Carolina lake. The giant goldfish was found in a park in Greenville County, according to NBC News. South Carolina wildlife authorities conducted a fish population survey, and they found a goldfish weighing 9 pounds, Mom.
And I read that, and they said that they think someone just dumped a regular goldfish into the lake, and they don't know how he got so big because there's no chemicals in the lake that would do that.
Mom, that reminds me of a story when I was little. I had a fish that died. His name was Freddie. And Dad replaced it with another fish that looked exactly the same. You remember that, Dad?
Yeah, it was a goldfish, and it's hard to find two identical goldfishes, but I was able to, and I did replace it.
Did you fall for it, Pete?
Yeah, and he started screaming at me. He said, "You know how many darts that took me to win?"
Yeah, and you also had a pet clam that you put on your.
All right, that's not for air, Pop. That was a private story. My pet clam is. I got to edit that out. Great, thank you.
Yeah, what's he going to do? Bark? I don't know. Just going to sit there on the shelf. We're going to wait for him to smell really bad.
And that is tonight's News Dump, brought to you by Chuck and Mary from Syracuse. Thanks, guys.
Good night, Pete.
Hey, good night.
All right, wasn't that fun? That was really great. I thoroughly, obviously enjoyed that. Folks always love when my mom and dad are on the show. And by the way, that's true. I saved a clam. My dad used to eat clams raw over the sink. He would stand over the sink with a knife and he would cut them open and he would put like Tabasco on them. He'd slurp them out. And I saved one at one point from imminent death in my dad's mouth, and I kept it for a couple days. And it began to smell, as you can imagine, very, very badly. So my dad actually did not even embellish that story. All right, let me get to my first guest. Shall we get to what you're here for? The guests, let's be honest, I get the best guests to join me on this show. And joining me today are two greats that have never been on before, but I'm very excited to have constitutional law scholar Carlton Larson of University of California to talk about treason. We hear that word thrown around a lot. He's written a whole book called On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law. That's coming up. But first, I'm very excited to introduce you to, if you haven't heard of him before, a very accomplished guy who is a psychiatrist and the author of several books, as well as the founder and executive director of the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. He's a Harvard-educated psychiatrist, internationally recognized for using things like self-awareness, self-care, group support to heal population-wide psychological trauma. And we are today talking about his new book, which is extremely relevant because of the trauma that we're all experiencing because of the pandemic. Again, it's called The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma. Here's my conversation with Dr. James S. Gordon. So now I have him, and he is the perfect guest, unfortunately, I suppose, for the times that we're in. Dr. James Gordon, thank you so much for joining me. It's an honor to talk with someone with your experience, credibility, and education on this show.
It's nice to be here, Pete.
Tell me, if you wouldn't mind, a little bit about how you got into this work, and because obviously you've been doing this for a long time, and you've been part of, I think, of an evolution of thinking in many ways. But who was young Jim Gordon? Did anybody call you that?
Young Jim Gordon is fine. Young Jim Gordon was a medical student who was troubled in some ways by the narrowness of medical education. I went to Harvard Medical School. People were very smart, but there wasn't too much room for imagination. And when I got into the hospitals, what I saw is I didn't like the way patients were being treated. That patients were objectified. We were standing around their beds, talking as if they weren't there. So I had a sense of how patients were, to use a kind of cliche, they were being disempowered, and there wasn't really the time to develop the kind of relationship with them that they needed, especially when they were going through really hard times. I was interested. I became a doctor. My father had been a doctor. My father was a doctor. My grandfather had been a doctor. And I wanted to be a doctor, to be with people when they were going through difficult times and to see how I could help them. And also, I became a psychiatrist because I was particularly interested in their life stories and how by telling your story to somebody, you could make a difference in how you felt. At the same time, I was also became active in the civil rights movement. So I had a sense of a connection early on between civil rights and patients' rights, and indeed all of our rights. And I became really interested in how to bring forward people's own stories, their own understanding, to give them a say in how they lived their lives and treated their illnesses.
Help me understand, because I and most of my listeners are not in your world, much less even the world of mental health, the difference between the psychological trauma that an individual might have in their upbringing, just in maybe an adverse situation as a child, versus one traumatic event, versus what you're really talking about here, which is a population-wide trauma. Is that a good question to ask you, kind of to separate the difference here, I hope?
Well, I think there is an important difference, but the first thing to recognize is that sooner or later, all of us are going to experience trauma. If we don't experience it from early abuse or neglect, there'll be later losses, disappointments, and as we grow old and grow frail and inevitably lose people and face our death, there's individual trauma. So we need to understand all trauma as a part of life and not something that just happens to those people with horrible, horrible childhoods or people who are in the middle of a war. What we're experiencing now is not only population-wide trauma, the kind I've seen in war zones or after a climate-related disaster and after Katrina or in Haiti, but we're seeing a universal trauma. Our whole population is trauma is a Greek word that means injury to the body, mind, or spirit. And this pandemic is injuring everyone. Everyone is traumatized. Everyone is thrown off psychologically and physiologically, more or less.
Yeah, I mean, I just was reading that study. I'm sure you were familiar. I don't know how much stock you put into these types of polling, but Gallup poll, I think, of Americans about our mental health. I mean, they take these types of polls. I don't know if you would question how they're conducted or if they're even effective, but I'm not sure you need a poll either. You can just look at your life and the life of all of your loved ones, your community. Even though you study this and write about population-wide psychological trauma, does anything compare to this? And talk a little bit about the history of what you have studied.
Well, what I have studied is when I started the Center for Mind-Body Medicine 30 years ago, I wanted to focus on the importance of self-care, self-awareness, and group support, how those could be used as basic sort of fundamental principles of helping people deal with stress and trauma and prevent and treat illness. Over the last 20 years, a major focus has been on working with whole populations that have been traumatized, working in the middle of wars, for example, in Kosovo or in Gaza when wars are going on, as well as just after wars, and going to places where there have been terrible devastation from climate-related disasters, and more recently from school shootings, for example, in Broward County, Florida, after the shootings at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, working in Appalachia with counties that have been affected by the opioid epidemic. And so going places with my team from the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, teaching local people our program of self-awareness and self-care and group support, and then helping them work with the whole community. The difference, however, now is that I and my team were going somewhere where the trauma was very pervasive, but we had some separation. There is no separation now.
You, the experts studying that trauma, had separation from it, and now you, the experts studying, you're in it?
Yeah, well, then, we were not only studying, we were everywhere we went, we were creating a practical program on the ground, training hundreds of people, or even in the case of Gaza, over 1,000 people who've worked with 270,000 people, close to 300,000 now in Gaza. So everywhere we were going, we were creating programs and creating local people who could do this work. But we ourselves, I could come back to Washington, D.C. I could be, here in my home and continue my life and continue my work with the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. Now I'm affected. My brother died early.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Dr. Gordon.
Other people I know have died. They've been hospitalized. Staff members have had COVID-19. They're still alive, thank God, but they're also continue to be affected by it. My whole life has changed. Instead of moving from place to place, I and the Center for Mind-Body Medicine were doing all our work online. So nobody is exempt at this point.
So you have worked all over the world, war-torn nations, and you've, counseled communities from the Balkans to areas destroyed and ravaged by ISIS, the Middle East. You just mentioned Gaza. You've been, of course, in the aftermath of natural disasters in places like Louisiana, Texas, California, Puerto Rico, Haiti, and California. You've also visited and worked in communities that have been affected by school shootings, including in Parkland, and with combat veterans and their families. And so, first of all, I think you've met your requirements, sir. I think you're getting in. Whatever happens next, you have passed the test. Thank you for all the work you've done. It's obviously a public service of sorts, and your leadership in the field. And you've developed all of these ideas and strategies and helped people so much. But before, again, we get to where we're at now, could you pick an example of any of the places that I just mentioned that you've been to and talk a little bit about your work and the work of your colleagues at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine and what your aim is to do and how it's effective?
Well, our aim is always, we go in with a question. And the question is, how does what we have to offer, how does it apply to your situation? Is it of interest to you? So, for example, when I began to work in Gaza in 2002, I would go to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, and I would go to the major non-government organizations, and I would explain to them that we have techniques that are grounded in science, grounded in biology. For example, very simple, slow, deep breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, with the belly soft and relaxed. I would tell them about it. I would teach it to the Minister of Health, to physicians and psychologists, and they would experience a change. After a few minutes, it might be a little bit more relaxed. I'd explain the research that shows how the techniques can affect brain functioning and brain structure. And then they would get interested, and we would create, as I met with a number of different organizations and found a local person or a local team to partner with, we would then create a training, and maybe 100 people would come to the first training. And we would I'd bring faculty, international faculty, for example, from the United States and Canada and Kosovo and Macedonia. I'd bring that faculty, say, to Gaza. We would do a training. 100 people would come. Over the course of 5 days, they would experience not only soft belly breathing, but 15 other self-care techniques, using guided imagery, using the imagination, moving the body, using drawings. And they would experience our small group model. So if we had 100 people in the training, there would be 10 small groups with 10 people in each group with one of our faculty members. At the end of that training, these people who would be health professionals or leaders of women's groups or clergy or educators, they would have experienced the benefits of our work themselves. They'd know the science, they'd experience the group model, they would experience changes in themselves. They'd feel less anxious. They'd be able to sleep better. People who were smacking around, quite literally, their wives or their kids, guys who were doing this.
Right.
Like a light bulb went on, and they say, I don't want to be doing this.
So anger.
A better state of physiological and psychological balance. And then we would continue to work with those 100 people, teach them how to use our model with others, and gradually build up a program so that ultimately in Gaza now, we have a whole team of leadership and faculty there who are carrying on the program. We've trained over 1,000 people, and they in turn have worked with almost 300,000 children and adults in Gaza.
That's amazing. And much of what you do is, of course, presented in your new book, The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma, which it details the step-by-step approach, this comprehensive approach of yours. But there might be folks listening that hear a little bit about what you said, what you applied in Gaza, or what you're teaching in this book, and say, well, I mean, how much of a difference can that make? I'm a science guy. I want evidence. I want studies, because this is your whole life. This is your whole career. You've been dealing with people questioning your approach. And I guess from based on what you said and what I know of your work, it's your approach starts with you questioning the kind of accepted Western medicine approach, et cetera, which you could detail a little bit, maybe the differences that you started or had. But how do you convince me and others that this works in terms of the research and the studies of your work?
That's a great question. First of all, there are studies on virtually every one of the 15 or 20 techniques that I teach in the transformation and that we use with people in our programs. And those studies are all, the references are all there in the transformation. They're all from refereed scientific journals. So, for example, we now know that meditating for as little as 20 minutes a day not only changes brain functioning, that parts of the brain work more easily with each other, but they also change brain structure. So the area of the brain called the amygdala that's responsible for fear and anger, if you meditate regularly, the size of the amygdala decreases and you're less angry and you're less fearful. And at the same time, parts of the frontal part of your cerebral cortex increase in size. There are more cells there, and you're able to think more clearly, to respond rather than react, and to feel more compassion for other people. There have been scientific studies published primarily out of Harvard and University of California, San Francisco. Many, many studies for that one modality. And the same with expressing yourself in words, or expressing yourself in movement, or physical exercise, or changing the way you eat. All of these can affect trauma. When you put them together in the kind of comprehensive program that we have, the gains are increased significantly. So we've published well over 20 studies on the use in peer-reviewed journals on the use of our model of self-care and group support to reduce post-traumatic stress disorder, diagnosable post-traumatic stress disorder, by as much as 80%.
All right. I'm going to ask you some of the steps that you detail in your new book, which is really interesting and already helping me recognize, by the way, what I've been doing personally that's working, because you then detail it. You give a name to some of the things I think I've done. And then, and more importantly, a lot of the things I never even thought to do or didn't think there was any importance to, or just haven't put nearly as much of a priority on. But before I ask you about those steps, please explain to me what's happening to us right now. What's happening to us collectively in this pandemic? And I mean, can you explain in a way, because it affects us all so differently? Like, I think I'm having an easier time because mostly things have started to go well for me again. I got laid off at the end of, or around this time last year, and I've rebuilt things. And my job now is being here in a shed, and I'm happy. I'm building a community and so on. But my wife is having a harder time. Most of the people I talk to are having some kind of different challenges. So it feels like it's different from person to person, but it's also, we're all collectively dealing with a lot. So how can we even, I don't even know how to ask, or how do we talk about what's happening to us?
But, you know, Pete, I think you demonstrate the first step. What you did is you thought for a little bit, you reflected on what's happening. You said, because you're in a pretty safe position, you can do your work from home. You're doing pretty well, but your wife is under stress and other people are under stress around you. So if your wife is under stress, I assume that affects you as well.
Oh, no, I completely, sir, I disconnect and I fly out here. Yes, it kills me. It kills me. And I add to it. I don't necessarily always help it. I try to solve it, which is not necessarily what she wants. So there's, yes, I'm joking. Yes, it absolutely affects me.
Do you have kids?
Yes, we have 2 teenagers. We have almost 16 years.
How is it affecting them?
Hard to know, but not as severely as it's affecting, I think, some others. And I'm not sure they even know what a normal 13 and 16-year-old or 15-year is supposed to look like. But I don't think it's affected them too badly, but I also think maybe it has in the long. I don't know. You tell me how to think about such things.
No, but I think it's a question of asking and checking it out. And you're right. Everybody's different. I have an 18-year-old son. Now, his passion is basketball. He wants to hopes to get a scholarship to play Division I basketball. He's serious about it. Basketball season's very much in doubt.
Right.
He is in school. He's got to wear a mask. He's got to keep a distance from people. He doesn't feel connected to people in the same way that he does. He's worried about his future. What's going to happen with college?
Well, I think what's happening to your son, not to interrupt the great doctor, and my daughters or anybody in high school, specifically if we're talking about high school, is I hear that. I just talked to my buddy. He goes, their 10th grade year is being stolen from them. I think that's a normal, adequate response and feeling, or even way to describe it.
Yeah, and they're often there's a tremendous anxiety about the future in young people. Now, not just in young people. People who are older are worried. And again, it's very much dependent. People like us, I'm able to do all my work online now. Yeah. I used to be traveling 3 weeks out of every month to these places affected by trauma. Now I'm meeting them on a screen. So, and I'm okay, but I worry about other people. I have to pay attention to my own health. I can't, I can't do the things that I'm accustomed to doing.
Right.
Those people who are out all the time, people who are grocery clerks, people, I talk with the mail people who come near my porch. We keep a little distance from each other. They're scared. They're facing danger every day. And they're often enough, they're facing people who are not protecting them. So they got to be with, somebody comes into a store, they're not wearing a mask, and they've got to deal with that. So it's a level of stress that's very, very high for everyone. And in certain communities, every Black person I know has lost a family member or close friend.
You
I've mentioned lost a family member as well, but everyone. And sometimes I was talking with a New York City, sort of an executive in the city administration, and she told me 6 members of her family have died.
Oy.
Uncles, aunts, grandparents. Yeah. But so it's, depending on who you are, it's more or less overwhelming. But for all of us, we have never seen anything like this. I suppose in some ways, the Second World War is the closest thing, but that was somewhere else, except for people who are in the military.
I want to get back to the steps that your book and your work takes to help the healing and help the coping, because I think these strategies are super important. But I do want to make one point based on what you said, or ask you one question based on what you just said. You mentioned Black folks, and I was thinking, and I know this is something that you know a lot about and have spent a lot of time thinking about, the psychological trauma of being in this category of vessel. I was thinking about minorities and women, and I've thought about this for years, because when white men walk outside, we're generally not afraid. We're men, so we're not afraid as much of sexual crimes, and we're white, so we're not afraid of hate crimes. So it may be straight white men. But I feel like if you're a woman, if you're gay, if you're Black, if you have other identifiable characteristics that might marginalize you, you have an understanding of what it's like to go outside and have some fear or a lot of fear. And because of that, you've built a certain resilience and understanding to it. And I getting to my point, I'll never forget when I was talking to a Black man named Bruce, a comedian, back in maybe 2005. And he was making fun of me and other white people for being so terrorized by the terrorist attack of 9/11. He's like, watching you be terrorized for the first time is phenomenal. It's hilarious. The point was, we've always been terrorized. So my question is kind of about like building resilience and understanding what it's like to feels like to be afraid to go outside. And then most white guys are like, this is the first time. And I wonder if that adds up to, don't tell me what to do. By the way, I'm not going to abide by any of your rules. I'll go outside and no one's going to tell me what to do. Did I get to a question? You know what I'm getting at.
Well, I think you brought up a whole bunch of issues. One of them is, yes, white people in general, probably men more than women, are feeling more vulnerable than they have before. A lot of those white men are pretending it's not going to happen. I'm still invulnerable. And that's a lot of the people, as I look at the screen, the television, a lot of the people not wearing masks are white people. And but more white men than white women. It's as if this can't touch me either. And that's what we psychiatrists would call denial, if not a delusion. I mean, it's ridiculous. Of course it can touch them. But the point that I have sort of many Black colleagues and friends who say exactly what you said. We've been here for a long time.
Right.
But so on the one hand, there is more resilience, but on the other hand, they are obviously even more vulnerable to the pandemic than people who are not people than white people are. The death rates are very, very threatening. And also, one of the things about trauma is if you've been traumatized before, in some ways you may become, if you've worked through it you may become more resilient, but you're also more vulnerable to present and future trauma. So, and then what you see, what happened, a friend of mine who's one of our faculty, who's a former New York City cop, black guy, he was a lieutenant in the NYPD. His son was up in Rochester and he was in a demonstration, and a Rochester cop shot him with a pepper spray in the eye. So this young guy is likely losing his eyesight. And his father, has both understands things from many sides because he's a former cop and he's black, and now he has a son who's vulnerable. Most of the black parents I've talked with are increasingly, this is following the demonstrations and the response to the demonstrations, increasingly concerned about their children.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much concerned about themselves because they have that kind of resilience that you're describing, but very worried about what's going to happen to their children, particularly to the boy children.
I think it's interesting. I'll never forget this past year. I interviewed a woman who's a chief executive at a billion-dollar company. I won't obviously say the name. It was private, but she's a black woman. And so my point is, she's very, very affluent. Her husband's a judge. She's got a lot of money. They live in a very, in a wonderful neighborhood, very safe. She has 3 sons in the ages of 18 and 22. And I just thought it was so interesting that someone a black person who lives in a rich and safe neighborhood is still so worried about her sons because they're in a category, they're in an age, and you so often seeing them, everybody knows what happens. So, and that's an affluent black woman. So people who live in other, areas, socioeconomics, it's even worse. But I just thought it was a great example to point out. Your book, The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma, is blurbed by John Kabat-Zinn. So when your book publicist, who basically I take anybody that David Cass tells me, because I have so much respect for him, sent me your book, I was like, well, Cass sent it, but John Kabat-Zinn blurbed it. This is a book that everybody must have and read. And now getting to it, I always love to just kind of mention the table of contents because I think it gets people interested. But you're talking about these coping mechanisms and ways to deal with everything that we're going through with the psychological trauma. And in the table of contents, it's befriending your body, the trauma healing body, make love, not war, nature heals, which of course is my favorite, animal therapy. And let me just ask you now about forgiveness. What's that chapter about, sir?
Well, that chapter comes toward the end of the book, because until you're in a state of psychological and physiological balance using some of the meditative techniques.
Got it. I should have asked you about an earlier chapter, I suppose. But yeah, go ahead.
And using guided imagery, until you're in a state of balance, until you're ready to be a little more appreciative, you're not so easily triggered and anxious and reactive, which is what's besetting so many of us now, you're not ready to forgive. And forgiveness is something that requires a fair amount of work if somebody has traumatized you, somebody's done something terrible to you. And some people want to be able to forgive. Others are not ready, or not yet ready, or never ready. When I think of forgiveness, my mind first always goes back to doing a training in Kosovo after the war. And one of the people in the training was a school teacher. And we did, toward the end of the training, we did a forgiveness meditation. And we were going around in our circle, in our small group, sharing our experience. He said, I am not, that forgiveness meditation was very good. I appreciated it. I was able to ask for forgiveness from somebody I'd hurt, which is part of the meditation. I felt a little more forgiveness for myself, but I can't forgive the Serbian paramilitary who killed my brother. He said, and he paused and he said, But on the other hand, I realized I don't want to spend my whole life seeking revenge. And I said, fantastic. That's you're moving along. Because up till then, night and day, he was dreaming about somehow finding this paramilitary and killing him.
Oh, wow. That's such a great story. And almost like, God, I love it. But that's such a great example, because you're talking about forgiveness of your opponent in a war who took someone you loved. I think what are we talking about with forgiveness as regards to the pandemic? Because we're so at each other's throats with shaming and blaming that you've done this, you're putting these people in danger. And obviously most of the blame, I think, going at policymakers. Either the government's not doing enough or they're doing too much, but everybody has an opinion either way on that. And so what are we talking about in terms of, do you think, forgiveness as it relates to where we're at with COVID-19 and living in, as I call it, pandemia, and where we might be if the vaccines are as effective as we hope they are in the best case scenario?
Well, what I would suggest as people come to that chapter is start with something easy. Forgive the guy who cut you off in traffic.
Oh, can you forgive anybody for anything, period? Starting with just general forgiveness.
Yeah, start that way. Start exercising this muscle with something. Forgive your partner for being a little rude to you or ignoring you this morning. So start there. And as far as, I think the issue is, it doesn't do too much good to hold a grudge. The point is to do what's going to make a difference. So and I think in this, one of the ways this election was very helpful, aside from removing the president, who in many ways was responsible for so much of the damage that came from the pandemic, is it mobilized people to do something instead of sitting around complaining and just being angry at him. The point is not to be angry at him. The point is to vote him out of office.
Yeah.
So looking for ways to be creative and not obsessing about our grudges, even if they're totally justified, against whether it's Trump or the governor or whoever it is that we're angry at. But let's do something. Let's make a difference. And so what our work does and what the transformation does is it gives them opportunities to do that. I'll give you another example.
Please do.
When working with kids in Gaza, we're working with a lot of kids who've lost family members. They were killed in the wars between Hamas and Israel. And a number of those kids, when they begin our groups, they want only to be martyrs. They want to kill Israelis and die in the process. That's their goal in life. As they come through the training, as they learn the techniques that I teach in the transformation, they come into balance, they start using their imagination, other alternatives start opening up because they're able to think more clearly and use their intuition and imagination. By the end of 9 or 10 groups, what these kids are, instead of picturing themselves with a suicide belt, quite literally, picture of a suicide belt around his waist, this 9-year-old boy pictures himself in a car. And I say, what's going on here? He says, I am the driver for the first president of Palestine. So the shift from wanting to kill Israelis and be a suicide bomber to wanting to become a productive member of a society and build a new country, that came about through his self-discovery.
And that story helps me get to literally what my next question is going to be, based on the table of contents and doing what I should have done and asked you about this one before forgiveness. But that's fine. I'm good enough at lacing it back together, Dr. Gordon. That kid went from the vengeance to hope. You have a chapter early in your new book titled Embracing Hope. Why is that a good and important thing to do? Sometimes people will say to me, you're an optimist. You always see the glass half full. You always have a lot of hope. I'm a realist. And so I think that hope is fleeting or misleading. You know, there's a lot of different, obviously, opinions and ways to look at hope. And how you feel about, I think, generally the future, and what we're living with now is the uncertainty, which is so difficult. So what is this, embracing hope? How dare you tell us to be so positive?
I think the point is, I'm saying it's possible. I'm telling stories about people who've been horribly traumatized, who've come out on the other side. And what I'm saying and what I'm teaching very early on is the technique that I mentioned earlier, this slow, deep, soft belly breathing. If you breathe slowly and deeply for 5 minutes and you feel a little more relaxed and you feel a change in your body, it's not a matter of me preaching hope. It's a matter of you seeing that you can make a change. We may not have control. We don't have control over all the external circumstances, but we can control what's going on in our body. We are no longer helpless, not because I'm preaching it, but because you're experiencing it. And if we're not helpless and we can feel that we can help ourselves, that gives us hope that we can make other differences in our lives. So it's not a theory. It's not a belief. It's not stupid optimism. It's grounded in reality. Now, the more of a sense you have of controlling and being able to use these techniques, these self-care techniques to make a difference in your own life, that gives you hope for yourself, and it opens the doors to doing other things, perhaps with other people or in the world, that may move you ahead in your life and give you more hope. This is not a matter of belief. It's a matter of experience, and it's a matter of evidence.
I know you've got to go in a few minutes. Do you have time for maybe at least one more question?
I got
Are you enjoying this? I don't want to. I mean, you're promoting a book. You want to enjoy talking about. I hope you're enjoying our conversation, because I'm so moved by your work and the fact that I'm talking to you. I can't believe I'm talking to you the whole time. So okay, then I realize as I'm reading the book, there's nothing in the transformation about whiskey. There's no suggestion for heavy drinking, which, according to anecdotally my own experience, I've drank more this year than I normally would. At times, I wouldn't even necessarily. I smoke a lot of reefer, sir, which I really like. But you don't, I mean, drugs. You talk about diet. You talk about the importance of exercise. I'll never forget early on after I lost my job, I tried 2 therapists. The first one said, don't drink. It'll make you depressed. I never really had a problem with it, and I don't think it's too much of a source for me. But the next one that I tried, next therapist, on the way out, Dr. Gordon, he said, one other thing that is going to help with your anxiety. You thought about this is cardio. And then I just left. It was not even part of the session. You talk about diet. You talk about exercise. You don't talk about drugs and alcohol, sir. Why not?
Well, I do. You got to read the last chapter. You haven't come to the last chapter yet.
Yeah, clearly I have not.
Or the next to last. I can't remember. But it's in there. What I'm saying, and it's some in the chapter on the trauma healing diet. The point that I make is that the reason we use alcohol, the reason we smoke weed, is because they do, at least for some of us, and this is important, we'll come back to this in a sec, they do decrease anxiety and improve our mood. So alcohol, for example, can decrease the level of cortisol, increase level of endorphins. The problem is increased dopamine. The problem is it's a short-term solution. If you keep drinking a lot, that will shift. You'll have more cortisol, you'll have less endorphins, and you won't be getting the same benefit. So that's alcohol. That's why we drink. And to drink a little bit is fine. And, if you drink a lot, okay, you'll suffer the consequences the next morning and you'll see if it's worth it. But long-term heavy consumption of alcohol causes more problems than it solves. Small amounts, moderate drinking can be very good after trauma. As far as marijuana, I would say it divides up roughly, and we're talking here about THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the active ingredient that makes you giggle and look at the world and see everything bright and have fantastically expanded imagination. For some people, cannabis with THC in it is what they call anxiolytic. It decreases anxiety. A lot of vets that I work with say this. For some people, Marijuana is anxiogenic. It causes more anxiety. People get paranoid.
For sure. Yeah. I think that's a great way of dividing how it affects people. At least, we could talk more about it. But what about, I only cut you off because I want to make sure I ask you, though, well, what about the prescription drugs, Xanax and the antidepressants and the anti-anxiety drugs? I've never tried any of those, and I really don't want to, but I know if used, really moderately or limitedly, I feel like it helps some people.
I would say those are a last resort. If none of the other approaches work, and I have it in the appendix of the book, I talk a little bit about it. There is no evidence that any prescription drug has a significant effect on people with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, can they lower anxiety? Some, yes. The problem is that the prescription drugs all have significant side effects and a significant risk of habituation and indeed addiction, meaning that when you stop using them, you have withdrawal symptoms.
Horrible.
Just as if you were using an opioid.
Horrible everybody's.
So I would use those as a last resort.
Right.
One other substance I want to mention, because I think it's very effective, it's cannabidiol, CBD oil. Now, I know there's been a lot of
really.
hype
I don't know enough. I haven't seen the latest research, but I've tried it myself, obviously, but I just haven't seen the research that it still seems like it's not really doing anything scientifically. But I don't know.
It's the research and the experience that I've seen with many people, including myself. Mm-hmm. It's very useful for sleep. So that's where I would think about using it for people who are. And there's a lot during this pandemic. So there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of agitation, a lot of difficulty sleeping. If you can get your sleep on a more even keel, you're going to be less anxious, less agitated. You'll function more easily. Cannabidiol is a safe and for many, many people, not for everyone, effective sleeping medication. And you can get it without a prescription, and it's anywhere.
Well, I'm not sure I spent too much time on that question because I know you didn't, but I think that it is what a lot of people know and resort to. And so I'm really glad I did ask you. But I think, you read about nature. So my final question, if you have time here, is about that. I like to call it vitamin N. And I've been telling my listeners every time they send me a picture from outside, no matter where they are, and they're all over the country, which is so cool, makes me feel better. And I get pictures sent to me and I'm trying to put together as a project, but it also is forcing people to take this podcast outside with them too and listen to it and send me those pictures. Vitamin N, my great friend Rich Louv writes, calls it, the writer Rich Louv calls it. What about it? Nature's healing.
We are virtually all of us, except for those few people who are really living in a completely rural area. We have a nature deficiency disease. We don't give enough. Our genetic programming is the same as the programming of the hunter-gatherers who lived their whole lives in pristine nature. We miss it. And even if we don't know it in our minds, our bodies know it and react just the way you're describing. When we're out in nature, the shoulders, which are up around our ears, start relaxing a little. We start breathing a little bit more deeply. We look around a little more. We feel maybe walk a little bit more easily. It's beautiful. And there's now, the last 20, 30 years, there's been a tremendous amount of research showing if you spend time in nature, or as you suggest, even look at nature, we lower our levels of stress hormones. Mood improves. We become more resilient. We become more satisfied with who we are, more content. So yes, everybody ought to be spending some time in nature, ideally sometime every day. One of the major criteria for where I live, even when I was living in one room, I wanted to be able to look out the window and see a tree.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you just real quick, the difference between me working in corporate media at Sirius XM on the 37th floor of a Midtown Manhattan building with no window, by the way, in my studio, and me sitting here in my garden shed. I'm looking now outside at the trees on both sides. I surrounded myself by windows. I'm looking at my garden. It's everything, sir. I mean, it's just what a transformation it's been for, I think, for my mental health, and A, not have that commute, and B, to have a space, a workspace like this. I'll let you go, but I don't know if our conversation can possibly, if any conversation, even one as lengthy as ours was, do justice to your work with your career and the book and what you detail. I think it's so important that people get this book for themselves and others. The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma. Sir, I will do a part 2 anytime you want. And how much do you charge for privates?
How much do I charge for?
For privates, because I have a few of my own specifics, sir. I'm kidding. You're a wonderful man.
I'll tell you, we have mind-body skills groups at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, cmbm.org. And everyone is welcome, regardless of their ability to pay.
Perfect.
If you can pay, we charge a reasonable fee. If you can't, we charge whatever you can pay. These groups are online and available. So that's the primary way that we're reaching people. I'm most of my work now is really working through these mind-body groups, working through training people who are interested in learning this work and using it with others in their community. And this is also, if listeners are interested in getting trained, if you're interested in getting trained, we'd love to train you, Pete. We want people who want to learn this and want to share it with other people. And you can look on our website, cmbm.org. We have training programs that are going on every couple months.
All right, I'll give you my impression of me without any training, trying to get started training other people here, and I'll let you go. Okay, here's me leading a training right now with my limited resources. Okay, everybody, I want you to get relaxed. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to start breathing deeply. Sir, what the fuck are you doing with your phone over there, sir? So I think I have a long way to go, Dr. Gordon. I think I have a really long way to go before I... A
little harsh, but we can work with you.
Thank you. I'm open to it. I'm really excited to have had the honor to be in a conversation with you and had you on my show, Dr. Gordon.
I'd love to come back sometime. Thanks.
Looking forward to it. Thank you so much, sir. Oh, such a great guest, such a great book. I highly recommend that you get it. And check him out. Check out his organization, the Center for Mind-Body Medicine as well, cmbm.org. It's all in the show notes, as always. Okay, my second guest today is the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at University of California, Davis School of Law. He's a Yale Law School grad and a scholar of American constitutional law and Anglo-American legal history. He's an expert on a wide range of issues, including enemy combatant detentions, legacy preferences in public universities, the historical basis of the Second Amendment rights, and parents' rights to name their children. So a lot of interesting expertise. And no one is more of an expert on the idea of treason than he is, which is why he wrote On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law. Here now, my conversation with Professor Carlton F.W. Larson. All right, I've got him now, and I'm very excited to talk to Carlton Larson, who is a very smart guy who's written a very important and smart book, clearing up a lot of issues in terms of the way we throw around certain words like treason and traitor. Welcome to Stand Up, sir. I'm so psyched to have you.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
I love talking to constitutional law professors or professors in general, but especially when they've written books like yours. Why do you think, though, that this book, as I have some thoughts, why do you think the book that you wrote needed to be written, that there would be demand for this explanation?
This was the subject of treason is something I've been working on for about 24 years. And for most of that time, it was of interest really to me and maybe about 6 other people. It was just a very obscure subject for the most part. And then starting in 2016 and really in 2017, it really just kind of exploded into public consciousness with lots of questions about whether or not Donald Trump had committed treason. And then when Trump started accusing other people of committing treason, whether those accusations had any merit. And so I started getting lots of calls from the media about this question. And since I was one of the few people who really studied treason, I tended to be the person they would come to. And so I realized that this is something people are talking about a lot, people care about, but there's really no clear, accessible, easily available guide to what this law really is all about. Because it's actually, in many cases, quite complicated. And if you try to dig into it on your own, you're going to go down some weird internet rabbit holes or end up with a bunch of really complicated court decisions that just don't make much sense. So this is my attempt to really explain the law of treason in a way that everyone can understand.
I feel like the words have been so diluted, and you say the demand for an expert like yourself started coming in, around Trump's inauguration or election and so on. But I mean, I listen to a lot of right-wing media. I certainly used to. And I feel like they use that word all the time. And I don't have evidence off the top of my head, but I'm just thinking about, because you said the timing of it, about Obama. Constantly, he was a traitor and treasonous, and others as well. Right-wing media, Rush Limbaugh saying that for years. And I feel like those kinds of accusations weren't legal. They were just thrown out on the radio, but it waters down, it dilutes the entire idea of it when, in fact, there is actually a legal background, history, and terminology, which is what you've written about. But do you think that was a thing, that they watered it down by just throwing it around so much?
Well, that's a big problem. A lot of people just use this term in a rhetorical sense without paying any attention to what it actually means in a legal sense. And that's unfortunate, because you can talk about treason or betrayal in this sort of very broad sense, where somebody sold you out. Where business partner moved over to the competitor or something like that. You might say you were betrayed or something like that. But when you start using the actual terms treason and traitor, that gets very close to the actual crime. And I think if we throw it around loosely, we got to be very careful, because treason is a capital crime. It's the highest crime known to the law. If you're convicted of this, you could be executed. And so it's not something that should just be tossed around lightly, and certainly not something that should be just used to tar political opponents. Right.
And it's one thing for, as we're noticing right now, with a whole bunch of people on the radio and on TV or on the internet, to say whatever they want. You can say whatever you want. Doesn't have to be true. It doesn't. You could defame people. It's hard to prove in court. You can threaten people. That's hard. People say whatever they want, but that doesn't work in a court. And so when all of those radio talkers would say it about Obama, it was one thing. But as you write in the book, Donald Trump has used the words to refer to basically everything. You say since, his inauguration, he's labeled Obamas as traitors, the Mueller investigation, New York Times, the entire media, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, Andrew McCabe, Democrats who didn't applaud his State of the Union speech. Let me add a few more. The cast of The View, puppies, pizza, the game of chess, fire. There's nothing this maniac hasn't considered treasonous or a traitor. And why does that matter, sir?
Well, Trump seems to have this almost, sort of very antiquated view that treason is anything that betrays him personally. Right. And the purpose of the United States and everybody in it is to be loyal to him, which is, of course, not the law at all. Right? We have a duty of loyalty to the United States, and that's very different than loyalty to a particular president. And one of the reasons that the crime is defined fairly narrowly in the Constitution is so that we are free to criticize our president and our political leaders and not be accused of treason.
So let's talk about the history of treason, which you cover extensively in your new book, which I'm really enjoying. But you say there's in the last 65 years, there's only been one person indicted in America for treason and 0 convictions. What is the history, the recent history? And I think we can go further back and talk about the Civil War.
Yeah, so the recent history really is that treason is just not something that has been prosecuted. The most recent case was in 2006 when Adam Gadon, who was a Al-Qaeda spokesperson, was indicted for treason. And he was someone who grew up in American citizen, grew up in Southern California.
That's right.
And somehow ended up in Al-Qaeda and was eventually killed by a drone strike. So he's never actually brought to trial. So he's the most recent one. And before that, you have to go back to the post-World War II prosecutions. Now, there's probably been a few instances of actual treason. I do think that the bombers of the Oklahoma City building probably could have been charged with treason by levying war against the United States. But it's often easier to charge people with other crimes, partly because treason has this very unique 2-witness requirement. You have to have 2 witnesses to the same overt act. And so that can make it somewhat difficult to prove in court.
Fascinating. Yeah. Why not go after them for other? This is how criminal law works, right? You go after them on the evidence that you have on, you make the best case you can, as opposed to, reaching too far and losing. I don't think I articulated that right.
Right. No, that's right. In the Oklahoma City case, they had 150 murder counts. You don't really need to, throw a treason charge on top of it.
Right. That's interesting. Why they wouldn't, even in a case like that necessarily. So what about, though, the Civil War? I mean, I feel like we hear the word treason often thrown at the Confederacy and the leaders of it.
So the Civil War was perceived at the time as an act of mass treason, that the North was fighting to put down the traitors. And the line in the battle cry of freedom, there's down with the traitor and up with the stars. And this clearly was treason under any understanding of the term. I mean, they were levying war against the United States. And so the question after the war was over is, well, what do you do about it? In theory, you could have criminally charged every single member of the Confederate Army and everybody who gave them support with treason against the United States. But that's totally implausible. If you have an event like the Civil War, you're not going to end it by a series of mass prosecutions. And certainly not of low-level soldiers. So the real question then was, what do you do with the highest-ranking people? So Robert E. Lee probably escaped because General Grant, as part of the surrender terms, essentially said, we'll let you go. But then you have Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, who was, if anyone was going to be hanged for treason, it would be him. And he was actually indicted for treason after the Civil War, and the case dragged on for a couple of years, but eventually fizzled out, and President Andrew Johnson ended up granting him a pardon. And so no one was convicted of treason as a result of the Civil War.
Wow. I didn't know any of that. I don't think I even knew the first part of that. Or if I did, I forgot, which is why it's always great to talk to someone like you and read a book like yours, because that I think that history is so relevant today. Now, let me ask you now about today. We go from 1860s to 2020. Is it treason to try to overthrow a democratically elected election? Is like people keep using the word coup and so on. Is there anything to be said about treason when you have all of these Republicans denying the outcome of election and saying, we're not going to listen to the people and their vote. We're going to overthrow a democratic election. That treason?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's certainly gross misbehavior. But so far, I haven't seen anything that would suggest that it actually amounts to treason as a criminal matter. And for it to be treason, it would have to be essentially levying war against the United States. That would require some use of force. So far, all you have is screwing around with lawsuits and, possibly trying to get state legislatures to get, select their own slate of electors. But all of that so far is peaceful. And so it couldn't be technically treason. Now, if you ended up with people armed in the streets and trying to actually overthrow the election, overthrow the government, then that might be a different matter.
Well, I think you might have that if they do that in Georgia or Michigan. I think they're going to burn it all down because it would be insane. But we could talk about that another day. What about Donald Trump himself? Is there anything that he has done or said that could be even remotely be described as treason? I got a couple ideas. Yeah. Can I just tell you? Maybe you can tell me why you think they're stupid or not legally accurate.
Yeah, so the first, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, what he was impeached over was interesting in that he basically withheld military support for an ally by trying to blackmail them for information, to do an investigation on Joe Biden. And in a way, that's allowing the Russians to invade one of our allies, but it's not us, I guess. So that means it's not treason. Or the other one I was thinking of is he's giving important intelligence away to our enemies, arguably, including, I think, the Russians at one point. He was accused of doing that. And I wonder if any of that even comes close to fitting the legal definition of treason.
Well, they certainly, I think, constitute a betrayal of the country in a colloquial sense. These are things that a president should not do. But I don't think they formally constitute treason because they don't actually constitute aid to an enemy. And the constitutional requirement is adhering to our enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And so the question is, well, what counts as an enemy? And this is fairly important. And that is that enemy isn't just any foreign country. It has to be a foreign nation or group with whom we are in a state of open war. And unfortunately, Russia just is not, or I probably should say, fortunately, we are not in a state of open war with Russia, because that would be a really bad thing if we were in such a state. And so that means that any aid that one gives, say to Russia or China or any of these countries that we think of it really as adversaries, doesn't amount to treason. Now, it still may be some other crime. Right? You can't just hand off military secrets to the Russians and get away with it. You can think about the Rosenbergs in the early 1950s who did that, and they were executed for espionage.
Yeah, what exactly did they do again?
So they essentially were spies for the Soviet Union. and they gained access to American military secrets relating to the nuclear program, and they passed those to the Soviets. And so they couldn't be tried for treason because technically we weren't at war with the Soviet Union, even though they were clearly our biggest adversary on the global stage at the time. And so they were then charged with espionage instead.
What else do we need to know in terms of the history of charges of treason in this country that I haven't asked?
Well, one thing one might note is, why do we even have a definition of treason in our Constitution? As we're unique, I think, among the countries of the world in having such a definition and such a fairly limited definition. So why did the framers think it was important to add that? And I think part of that was their own experience during the American Revolution, that they had been charged with treason by the British for what they were doing. Not just in the war, but in the period leading up to the war, when they engaged in various forms of tax protests and other types of disobedience that the British said was treason. The Americans said, no, it's not. We're simply exercising our rights and protesting lawfully. And so because of that experience, they realized that this was a crime that's particularly subject to abuse. If there's one sort of crime where we sort of worry the most about government prosecutions being inappropriate, it's in this area.
When I'm reading your book and researching you and think about, you can't help but think about ask about how other countries do this. And you mentioned obviously the British, who we got our independence from, and that's how you just explained it. But right now, how do other nations see treason? Do they have similar definitions? It's always fascinating, by the way, talking to someone like yourself, who's a constitutional scholar, about other countries' constitutions and how they define things like this. So what do we have to learn, and how do other countries how do other countries deal with this? I think Saudi Arabia will just chop your head off for, if you're a woman driving. That might be too extreme, but they will put you in prison. Other countries have some pretty harsh penalties for crimes. I don't know that they're defined necessarily as treason, a crime against the country itself. So how do they do it in other worlds?
So I think in most countries, it's usually done by statute, meaning the legislature is free to change it. And then part of this just gets into terminology. As we if you can get executed for espionage, that's a pretty serious crime. Or you can create other crimes. Just call it a general disloyalty or something like that. Think about some of the things that China is doing. With respect to Hong Kong, sort of, call it a national security law or whatever. You can pick some term and then use that to cover a wide variety of potentially disloyal offenses. So it's not always going to be the case that the term treason will be what's in play,
right?
Necessarily in many of these other countries.
But to be clear, we didn't invent the word or the idea. I would imagine the idea has been around forever. But the legal basis for it, I think, is a lot of what you're focused on. What are the mine wars of the 20s, and why do they matter?
So the mine wars in the 1920s were a series of disputes between coal miners in West Virginia and powerful mine interests that erupted into essentially an open war in the West Virginia mountains. Culminating in a battle called the Battle of Blair Mountain, in which a number of people were actually killed. And this is an event that very few people know about. We're not taught it in our American history courses. I certainly was not taught it. I didn't really even learn about it really until a few years ago. And this resulted in charges against the miners for treason against the state of West Virginia, one of whom was convicted, and then he fled. He skipped bail before his appeal could be resolved. And so he's the only person in the 20th century actually convicted of treason against an individual state. And so it's not just the federal crime, but it's also a state crime. You can, in theory, commit treason against, Michigan or Kansas or Ohio or whatever, or in this case, treason against West Virginia.
It's fascinating. I didn't know about that at all until I was reading your book. It's really interesting. I always think it's interesting, the things that get left out, by the way, and why they get left out. What about Hipólito Salazar? Who is he? Why was he? I don't want to give away. You tell me.
Okay, so Hipólito Salazar is actually, I think, the story in the book that I'm most excited about, because it counters what I had and every other treason scholar had said for years, which was that no one had ever been executed by the federal government under the U.S. Constitution for treason. And it turns out this was wrong. There actually was such a person. This was Hipólito Salazar, and it came in Taos, New Mexico in 1847 during the Mexican-American War, where American forces had conquered the the Mexican state of New Mexico. And the American military generals on the ground said to everybody, okay, you guys are all, New Mexico is now part of the United States. You are all United States citizens, and anybody who resists is guilty of treason against the United States. Well, this is completely absurd under the law at the time, and certainly would be true now. I mean, if you imagine, say, that some American general in Baghdad in 2003 said to the Iraqis, "Okay, Iraq is now part of the United States. You're all U.S. citizens. Anybody who fights us is guilty of treason against the U.S." I mean, it's just absurd. New Mexico wouldn't become part of the United States until a year later in 1848 with the treaty that ended the war. But officials on the ground went ahead with treason trials, and one of those persons was Hipolito Salazar, who was convicted of treason against the United States. And this was a Mexican citizen who was tried on Mexican soil for the crime of treason against the United States, a country he had never set foot in.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
It's crazy. Absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy.
A Mexican citizen arrested and tried on Mexican soil for the crime of treason against the United States, a country he's never set foot in.
Yes. And
sorry to laugh, Hipolito. I'm sorry, sir, but that's crazy.
No, you can't make this stuff up. History really is stranger than fiction. And as word of this eventually reached Washington, the Polk administration had been completely embarrassed by this, and they had to admit that they'd made a mistake and that treason was not an appropriate charge for this person. But they said, well, he was a bad guy anyway. He was basically a murderer, and so he should have been hanged for something.
God. By the way, the definition of why we should not have capital punishment, because sometimes mistakes happen, and this guy was executed, and unfortunately, so many others have been as well. So fascinating. All right,
his last words as he was being hanged were "Carajo los Americanos," or "F the Americans." Ha!
Wow. Oh, that's interesting. What was he accused of doing? What had he done wrong again? He
had been part of a revolt against by the New Mexican natives against the American military occupation. And so
it seems noble.
Essentially, what he was essentially doing was he was fighting in the Mexican War for the Mexican side. I mean, that's what he was doing. And generally we don't say that when we have a war between two countries, that the people on the other side are traitors to the other side. I mean,
right. That's right. The Germans, the Nazis were not traitors to America.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And now they're back. So much more to say. Do treason scholars have a convention, Professor Larson? Is there a treason scholar convention? And if there is there cosplay? What do you wear?
No, I think it might be me and maybe about 4 other people.
That sounds like a party.
We could probably all fit in a car.
It's a really important book, and I highly recommend that people get it and read it. And I think that one of the things you can do if you don't want to be well liked is at a cocktail party or in a conversation, tell people to stop throwing around the words the way they do, and you have all the information in this book to back up that argument, because I can't imagine anything that irritates you more than hearing in media or the current president using these words, treason and traitor, the way that they do.
Yeah, I mean, it is incredibly irritating. On the other hand, it gave me a good reason to write a book. So,
fair enough.
Making some lemonade out of lemons here, I guess.
Well, we're all better for it. You are a constitutional scholar at a prestigious university, University of California, right? You attended Yale and Harvard. You have quite an impressive background, obviously. So I've got to ask you just a couple of questions about the current situation in the Supreme Court. What are your thoughts on what's the question specifically, how I want to word it to the scholar? The history of the makeup of the court in terms of the numbers. Constitutional scholars have been really good at educating us that there's nothing in the Constitution that says 9 scholars. And in the past, there's been more, there has been less. What do you think is the direction forward for the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so you're right. So the number of 9 justices isn't specified in the Constitution. It started out, I think, at 5. At one point, it was 6. It was back to 5. It was 7. It was 9. It was 10. Then it's been back to 9. It's been 9 since the late 1860s. So it's sort of kind of stuck as a convention. I mean, there was a lot of talk prior to the election that if the Democrats gained control of the Senate, they would try to expand the Supreme Court. Clearly, that's not going to happen now. You already have at least one Democratic Senator, Joe Manchin, saying he doesn't support it. And I suspect there'll probably be a few others who wouldn't support it. So we're going to have, I suspect, a 9-justice court going forward. And that's a court that's going to be 6-3.
5-4, 6-3.
Conservative to liberal, which will be the most conservative Supreme Court we've had since the early 1930s. by far. And so, the big question for all of us is, what's going to happen? How aggressively will they move on various issues? And that's always hard to know. Sometimes, courts move more slowly than one expects. But, I think just a lot will depend on the individual temperament of particular justices. We really don't know that much about Justice Barrett, for example. I mean, she's only been a judge for a few years. So it's hard to know.
But when you say, when a constitutional scholar especially says it, the most conservative court since, I think it's really interesting then to ask you, my friend Eric Siegel uses the word deviations. I don't know if that's standard in your conversations, but he basically is saying, I think he says, I may have this wrong, that Amy Coney Barrett is, a couple of deviations to the right of Scalia. Is there any world in which you would agree to that? Can you tell?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know, again, because she's only been a judge for a few years. There were certainly areas where Scalia was not a movement conservative. In a number of criminal justice cases, he would side with criminal defendants. In free speech cases, I mean, he famously voted in, protect flag burning. So there were moments where Scalia had his sort of idiosyncratic moments. I do think Eric is right in that there's going to be fewer of those idiosyncratic moments from Justice Barrett. So I do think she will, on balance, be more conservative than Scalia was. But again, we also don't know what the issues will necessarily be over the next 20, 30 years. Those issues can change. And the things that we're maybe worked up about now may not necessarily be the issues we're most worked up about 10 or 20 years from now.
One of the most fascinating conversations about the Supreme Court in America that I've been hearing a lot recently is how, just about originalism and someone recently saying there was the originalists didn't believe in originalism. It's new. You know what else is new? This conversation about the Supreme Court. You know what else is new? Abortion as an issue in America. These are actually fairly new issues. The argument over the Second Amendment, I think late 70s, early 80s. Same thing with abortion around that time, the rise of the religious right in using those issues. So I just want to ask you what your perspective is on originalism as an idea and those specific issues, guns, women's reproductive rights, as being new arguments, not arguments that were really had for like 200 years of this country's existence. Am I anywhere close to warm?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the problems with thinking that the Constitution has clear answers to every conceivable question, and that those answers are clear in 1787, is that's just simply not true. I mean, suppose you were asked right now to create a Constitution that will resolve all of the political disputes currently going on in the United States, establish a framework for resolving them going into the future, and provide clear and definitive answers to every conceivable legal issue you can imagine in the year 2250.
I would nail it, but
right. Yeah.
Other people, I think, would struggle with their predictions about time travel, life-saving cures, and weapons that can kill the earth that are the size of a dime. They might quibble with that, but I mean, yet it doesn't make any sense. You're absolutely right. There's just no way to predict what, actually the joking example I gave weren't too bad, is going to happen in the future. So making laws about it today, it makes no sense. You have to evolve as things evolve, as technology evolves.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of these questions don't have a clear answer. I mean, is it a search under the Fourth Amendment if the cops stand out on the street and use some type of heat seeker to detect heat coming out of your house? Right. I mean, that's, I think, a genuinely tough question. You can argue that either way, but I don't think what you can clearly say is that this is definitively resolved by, the Fourth Amendment's text in 1791. It's going to require some judgment and thinking about how this older text is going to apply in a modern era. And there's a lot of questions like that. I mean, that doesn't mean that judges can just do whatever they want. Right. I mean, I think the Constitution still does provide a basic framework for thinking about these things, and in many cases, simply for allocating power, determining who decides. That is, there are going to be difficult issues, some of them which are clearly just left, to legislatures or to Congress.
At what point, though, do judges, exceed, in your opinion, their expertise and their boundaries and their authority? Because we can talk about the three different branches of government, and the legislative branch that, makes a law. Let's say in a perfect world, they made a law based on the best public policy. Let's say that Congress made a law about women's health care that was based on all of the women's health care experts that agreed. That's how they made the law. The court then gets it and says, well, I don't know about this. To me, that's so deeply offensive. Like, you're a judge. You're not an obstetrician. You don't get to have a say. If all the OB-GYNs say this is the best thing to do for women's health, and Congress approves of it and passes a law based on the best available science, the judge doesn't come in and say, you've gone too far. And I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but as it relates to the Constitution, I don't think that they have a say.
Well, I mean, this raises sort of this very big question as to whether, on balance, is judicial review beneficial or not? Because you might say that, for the most part, judges just keep their noses out of these things and leave it to the political process to sort that out. And I think that's something that, Democrats believe very strongly with respect to issues like the environment and government regulation and economic regulation and things like that courts should keep their nose out of it. Republicans tend to believe the same thing when it comes to issues like campaign finance or abortion, that all these things should just be left to the Democratic branches. And so you inevitably are going to have argument, and you see this as justices do this. They constantly point out how the other side, well, in this case, you wanted to defer to the political branches, and in this other case, you didn't. And you can always sort of point out inconsistencies in that approach. And it unfortunately tends to really track the underlying, political views of what's being discussed, right? So you're likely to defer to legislation when you agree with the legislation, and you're likely to not defer to it when you don't agree with it. Nope. And that's true across all the justices, regardless of party.
Do you consider them justices, or are they really politicians in robes? Or do you hate that question because it's binary and stupid?
Well, I think it's a hard question, because I would say in probably 80% of the cases the court decides, they really are acting as simply just elite lawyers, in the sense that they're dealing with technical questions, usually pretty boring, often of no interest to anybody. They're just trying to resolve disputes among the lower courts. And in many of those cases, they're unanimous or very close to unanimous. And so in those cases, I do think they really are. They're judges. There's these handful of other cases that really hit these really polarized political issues where it's just very hard to separate out, political and philosophical views from your view of the Constitution. And I do think that all the justices are trying their best. They honestly think that their view of the Constitution is the correct view. It's just that people are going to have different views of that based on their own experiences and their own identity. So in those highly charged cases, you are going to see these political and ideological divisions.
I think I'd push back, but I can't think of an example of where, when you say they're doing what they think is best in terms of the Constitution, and it's like, I think of the inconsistencies of certain justices' decisions and opinions, where on this case they decided it this way, and then they're completely inconsistent in a different situation where obviously the same rule would apply. I wish I was smart enough to remember how many of these examples I've heard over the years, but I can't think of any. I do know. I feel like it's Scalia and Clarence Thomas a lot, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of those. I mean, you can have, if you just want to take Justice Thomas saying, that racial classifications are per se impermissible, as it was a reason to invalidate affirmative action, but then goes and says, well, it's just fine if you're talking about segregating a prison, right? Or Justice Thomas, who says we always need to look at the original understanding of a particular provision, except he doesn't do that when it comes to the 14th Amendment and affirmative action. He certainly doesn't do it when it comes to the First Amendment, when it comes down to, striking down restrictions on advertising. So there clearly are
well done
inconsistencies in terms of the reasoning that gets them to the outcomes they reach.
I could ask you for what you think is the most positive Supreme Court decision ever or in recent times, but instead I want to ask you what you think is the most damaging, and I'll go first, and you tell me what you think. But I'll name two decisions that I think have done the most damage, and I'll leave it at that in general. They are Citizens United, which is about campaign finance, and Shelby Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, which was everything that Dr. King and John Lewis and other civil rights heroes fought for. I feel like they've done the most damage to this country, and I feel like campaign Citizens United is really got to be the worst because it touches on every issue, no matter what issue you care about. It says corporations are people, money is speech, and it doesn't matter what the issue is. We're going to bowl you over with our money. So how did I do? Do you think that those are good examples? Is there anything? Is this even a fair question? I like to ask all constitutional scholars.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree. Shelby County is one of the worst decisions ever in the history of the Supreme Court. And this is the decision that struck down the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. So that said that states were now free to essentially do whatever they wanted with voting rights without having to get permission from the Justice Department. And this allowed the proliferation of a number of very bad laws in the states that have been subject to that. Now, that did affect, it's not every state. There's only a handful of states that were subject to this.
But for good reason, because they did racist things.
Right. The reasoning for this was really poor. I mean, this had been approved by Congress in 2006 unanimously, bipartisan support for this. And so for the court to say, basically said, well, you relied on old data, and that was the whole problem. Well, that was really, quite a specious argument and an example of the court, really inserting itself into an area where it did not belong. I mean, it's very clear that the Reconstruction Amendments were intended to be enforced by Congress, not by the court, and the Congress had a huge amount of authority with respect to those amendments.
And they approved it. The Congress approved it like 98-0 in the United States Senate. George W. Bush confirmed that. Congress had it under control. They weren't divided. Senators weren't divided, and then the court came in and overturned it. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so I think it's utterly egregious. I'm probably less upset about Citizens United.
How dare you, sir?
Well, it's just in part because I'm not convinced anymore how much money is really driving campaigns. I mean, if you think about some of these recent campaigns, think about Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. Yeah. Jamie Harrison had tens of millions of dollars more than Lindsey Graham and lost. And this was true in a number of other races as well, where the Democrats had a huge money advantage and it didn't necessarily translate.
You are absolutely right on the merit of that argument. However, I think it discounts basically how much the money influences people's opinions on issues with their lobbying. And I think that's hard to measure, as well as who has access to run. I think that the best example is like the 2016 primaries when it was like Ted Cruz versus Trump, and Cruz had one donor, I think, Sheldon Adelson. Like he had one guy financing his campaign left. That was it. And it was enough, to keep running ads and stuff. So, and he lost, as you said.
Yeah. I mean, clearly campaign finance is a mess. It needs reform. But I don't think it's the case that whoever has the most money automatically wins.
The book is On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law, Professor Carlton F.W. Larson. It was so great to talk to you, man. I really enjoyed, I'm really enjoying reading the book, and I love being able to ask a bunch of questions to you. Thank you so much for joining me. We're all smarter for it.
Oh, thank you. Very much enjoyed it.
All right, another con law scholar. How about that? We'll have to have him on with Siegel. Professor Carlton Larson. The book is On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law. Definitely have to have him back on a wide range of other issues that I speak with Siegel and others about as well. That is today's episode of Stand Up. Please consider signing up and supporting the show with a paid subscription, because while the show is free, it isn't cheap. I work real hard on it every day, getting these great guests for you, recapping the news with a little analysis, and I always want to hear from you as well. But please support the show with a paid subscription. Go to the paid subscription link in the show notes anytime, or go to standupwithpete.com and you can sign up there as well. All right. You also get access to the Discord platform and our entire community tomorrow night, Thursday, the 10th. We'll be hanging out at 8 p.m. East on Zoom. Hope to see you there. And that is it for today. I love you. I appreciate you. I thank you. Send me your nature pictures, and I will talk to you tomorrow on Stand Up. Take it away, Johnny Carroll.
Let the brave meet the challenge, let the meek weak flee. Oh, you better stand.